Hello, my name is Father Bill Lytle and I serve as Director of Christian Formation at St. George's Episcopal Church in Clifton Park, New York. Welcome to Part 7 of our occasional series, C.S. Lewis and the Four Last Things. Now today I'd like to start to talk about Chapter 10. In the last session we squeezed 3 chapters into one, and Chapter 10 we're going to spread out because it's very long and it's full of important ideas. So today we're just going to address the first part, and I think you'll see that that's probably more than enough. The reason that it's so full of ideas is that at the beginning of this chapter, our narrator, for the first time, gets his own solid person to talk to. Up until this point, we've just been speculating with him about what's going on. But finally, he has someone who has been sent to guide him. And this is George MacDonald. Now, MacDonald was a real 19th century author who was very influential in Lewis's own life and in his own conversion. Our narrator tries to introduce himself, but he fails since the guide seems to know him better than he knows himself. And then he launches right into asking the question that has been nagging him since he encountered the cynic a few chapters back. And that is, do any of the ghosts stay? Can they stay? And what is actually going on here? So MacDonald tries to explain what is going on, that it's a refrigerium, this excursion for the damned. Now that in itself is an obscure theological idea, to be certain, and not one that's too easily defended or explained. But we have to remember that this is a dream, this is a fantasy story, so I don't think we need to worry too much about the theological grounds for this idea. And we have to remember that Lewis specifically warned us back in the preface against factual curiosity in the afterworld. That's not what this is about. This is about something else entirely. As MacDonald goes on, however, we do begin to get the sense that whatever conditions we may find beyond death, they will likely surprise us all in one way or another. Just as the narrator comments that both his Roman Catholic and his Protestant friends would have objections to what he's experiencing. That, I think, is a good attitude for us all to cultivate in relation to the Four Last Things. We have to be careful about grasping too tightly to any theological notions, as sound or as comforting as they may seem, that are developed totally by humans on this side of the divide between life and death. So keep that in mind as we go on. So our narrator presses his guide about whether the ghosts can stay. And the answer is surprisingly yes. This raises another issue, however, about one of the four last things that we haven't talked too much about so far, and that's judgment. Is judgment not final, he asks. Can one really escape hell for heaven? MacDonald's answer illustrates the point I just made. It depends on the way you're using the words. We can't even reliably define heaven and hell, let alone decide what happens to the souls in either place. This is because we cannot begin to understand eternity. MacDonald goes on to describe what I think is a very important concept about eternity that we often miss. We humans, bound by time as we are, usually envision eternity as marching forever forward into the future. But if eternity is really to be eternal, it must extend in all directions. From the perspective of eternity, we will not be able to mark the point on a timeline when we entered heaven or hell. Just as both states will extend forever before us, so they shall spread retroactively into our past. Both processes begin before death, says MacDonald. And we have all experienced that. We all know some experience that seemed horrendous, terrible at the time, that we now recall with joy and fondness. Or something else that we considered a delight in the moment, which now fills us only with loathing and regret. In eternity, that process will be complete. The blessed will say that they have always been in heaven, and the damned that they have always been in hell, and both will speak truly. We see there that judgment is final in a way that we can't begin to comprehend. It's not an instantaneous event that we can point to, but rather something that eternally transforms every moment of our existence. MacDonald's account of how each group, the blessed and the damned, will experience this is very important, and I'd like to read a bit of that. Among the lost, he says, one will say he has always served his country, right or wrong, and another that he has sacrificed everything to his art, and some that they've never been taken in, and some that, thank God, they've always looked out for number one, and nearly all that at least they've been true to themselves. And the saved? Asks our narrator. The saved. What happens to them is best described, MacDonald says, as the opposite of a mirage. What seems, when they entered it, to be the veil of misery, turns out when they look back to have been a well, and where present experience saw only salt deserts, memory truthfully records that the pools were full of water. Now, what does that mean? Well, in that, we should all find words of challenge and comfort. Challenge because we all say, or at least think, those mottos of the damned. Indeed, being true to oneself is perhaps one of the highest values of our culture, and here Lewis lists it as the one thing that everyone in hell has in common. Yet the lot of the saved should likewise be a great comfort to us as we trust in Christ. All of the trials and tribulations of this life are reverse mirages, and one day we shall see them for what they truly are, means of grace and opportunities for sanctification. I want to be clear, though. To say our veil of miseries or are truly wells does not mean that the pain and sorrows of this life are not painful and sorrowful, or that they're somehow imagined. Rather, it is to say that pain and suffering, indeed death itself, are all instruments of our blessedness. As we shall see in future chapters, this retroactive eternity can transform even the most hideous and wretched parts of our lives into wonderful creatures of glory. Knowing this is not an analgesic, a painkiller to numb our pain today, but rather it's the foundation of our hope for tomorrow and forever. So at this point, our narrator thinks he begins to understand. Then heaven and hell are only states of mind, he says. Not quite. But MacDonald's answer may still surprise us. The distinction he makes between heaven and hell is vital and has been foreshadowed symbolically throughout the whole book. Just think about how the ghosts walk over the grass, and will be fully explained further on. Hell, he says, is indeed a state of mind. Indeed, every state of mind, left to itself, every shutting up of the creature within the dungeons of its own mind, is in the end hell. Sin is in essence a turning inward, a turning away from God and His intentions for us and for our fellow creatures. It's a turning towards ourselves and a worship of ourselves. And the further we turn into ourselves, the more we trap ourselves in the dungeons of our own minds, and the more pervasive our sin becomes. Hell, then, is the end game of sin. It's merely the result, of sin having run its full course. We turn inward until we've turned inside out and shut ourselves off from everything else, from reality. Hell is not a positive reality then, but a negative one, like darkness. It's not a thing in itself, it's the lack of a thing. Next time, we'll see this idea worked out further on in the chapter when we meet the woman who is famously no longer a grumbler, but only a grumble. Now, heaven, on the other hand, is the opposite of a state of mind. It is reality itself. It is the result of the opposite process, turning outward towards God and His intentions for us and His fellow creatures. Self becomes meaningless as our focus is always directed toward God and neighbor. And in the process, then, only then, is true self found and heaven attained. So what about the choice? The narrator is still not quite satisfied as to whether the ghosts can really make a choice here. What do they choose, these souls who go back, he asks. They choose, like Milton said, to rule in hell rather to serve in heaven. There is always something, says MacDonald, they insist on keeping, even at the price of misery. There is always something they prefer to joy, that is, to reality. They're like petulant children. We're all like petulant children. They choose to sulk for eternity, but they give it grand names: revenge, injured merit, self-respect, tragic greatness, proper pride. And we all must beware, because all of those things are things we value, things we have been taught to value by the world that we live in, whether we like it or not. The important part is this: hell is not a punishment doled out by God. It is a choice made by us. All who are willing to admit that they've been mistaken, that they've mistaken the means for the end, all who are willing to have a good laugh at themselves, as he says, may begin again like a little child and enter into joy. Yet as simple as that seems, so many of us refuse. For to do so, we must care more about joy, that is about reality, that is about God, than we do about ourselves. And in the end, that's what creates the great divorce, what divides all humanity into two irreconcilable categories: those who say to God, "Thy will be done," and those to whom God says, "Thy will be done." More of chapter 10 next time. Goodbye.